Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I really wish I could be there in person. But as I mentioned to Glenn earlier, it's been a bit of a weird day, filled with a series of just some very odd events. But everything is fine now, and I'm glad I could join everybody here via Zoom. And I'd like to start off tonight with a prayer. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for granting us another opportunity to fellowship, giving us another Shabbat. We thank you for your everlasting grace, your everlasting mercy. And I pray that whatever leaves my mouth tonight is going to come from you. In Yeshua's name. Amen. Okay. So as Mike so wonderfully read earlier, 1 second to work things out here. This Parsha goes over the continuation of last week and the very intricate story of Jacob, and as he now begins moving over from Beersheba, going over to a different land. And where I'll be starting off, I'll be taking this a little bit differently. I thought I would discuss some of the different complexities um, of Jacob, of his actions, and specifically touch maybe a little bit on biblical morality and a little bit into how every one of our actions tends to have a reaction, which can be a good or a bad thing. And I will be starting off from last week's Parsha, where we discussed Esau relinquishing his birthright to Jacob, although this was done with quite a little bit of trickery with the help of Rebecca and coming up with a plan of how they would trick Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than blessing Esau, and combining all of this with now Esau receiving both the blessing and the birthright. So picking up exactly where Mike left, Jacob takes Esau's birthright, leaves Beersheba, and heads to Haran. Jacob falls in love with Rachel and asks for her hand in marriage. And I'm fast forwarding things a little bit here to get to my main point. And in Genesis chapter 28, starting in verse 8, referencing his interactions with Rachel, Yaakov had fallen in love with Rachel and had said, I'll work for you for 7 years in exchange for Rachel, your younger daughter. Lavan, their uncle, answered to him this way, said, better that I give her to you than to someone else. Stay with me. So Yaakov worked 7 years for Rachel, and it only seemed like a couple of days to him because he was so much in love with her. In the morning of the wedding day, Yaakov saw that he was with Leah, her sister, and he said to Laban, what kind of thing is this that you've done to me? Didn't I work for Rachel? Why have you deceived me? Laban answered, in our place, that isn't how it's done. To give your younger daughter before the firstborn. Finish the marriage week of this one, and will give you the other one in exchange for the work that you will do for me during yet another 7 years. So what I wanted to highlight here is almost the line, a similar line of trickery that was used from Jacob and Rebekah to Isaac. Jacob finds himself in an oddly similar situation, although in much different circumstances, much different consequences, where Lavan attempts to manipulate him in some ways and is not forthright with him. The entire time he planned on marrying off his eldest daughter and did not really have in plan giving off his younger daughter, Rachel. And I thought this is a bit of an understanding of how this is a direct measure for measure retribution. And I think it's a fundamental principle of some of the biblical morality that's touched all throughout the Old Testament, as we see just throughout all scriptures. So now, eventually, after the 7 years of labor, he gets to marry Rachel as well. And combined, they bear 12 sons, obviously the 12 tribes of Israel. And fast forwarding a little bit again to Genesis chapter 30. Now Jacob tricks and plots against Laban. Starting off in verse 25. After Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Yaakov said to Laban, "Send me on my way, so that I can return to my own place, to my own country. Let me take my wives, from whom I have served you, and my children, and let me go. You know very well how faithfully I have served you." Laban answered him, "If you regard me favorably, then please listen. I have observed the signs that Adonai blessed me on account of you. Name your wages," he said, "and I will pay them." Yaakov replied, "You know how faithfully I have served you, and how your livestock has prospered under my care. The few you became, I increased substantially. Adonai bless you wherever I went. But now, when I provide my own household, but now how will I provide for my own household?" Laban said, "What should I give you?" "Nothing," answered Yaakov. "Just do this one thing for me. Once more I will pasture your flock and take care of it. I will also go through your flock and pick out every speckled, spotted, or brown sheep, and every speckled or spotted goat. And these and their offspring will be my wages. I will let my integrity stand as witness against me in the future when you come to overlook the animals constituting my wages. Every goat that is not speckled or spotted, every sheep that isn't brown, will count as stolen by me." Laban replied, "As you have it, so be it." Going on to verse 39. The animals mated inside of the rods and gave birth to streaked, speckled, and spotted young. Yaakov divided the lambs and had the animals mate with the streaked and brown in the flock of Laban. He also kept his own livestock separate and did not have them mixed with Laban's flock. Whenever the hardier animals came in heat, Yaakov would set up the rods in the watering troughs so that the animals would be seen and conceive in front of them. But he didn't set up the rods in front of the weaker animals. Thus, the more feeble were Laban's and the stronger were Yaakov's. In this way, Yaakov ended up becoming very rich with very large flocks, along with the male and female slaves, the camels, and the donkeys. So it seemed, even at this time, for a Yaakov, had maybe a simple understanding of genetics, as to how Laban thought he was getting the lesser of the livestock, but in actuality, Jacob seemed to know that, you know, the spotted animals, that is a recessive trait. And even if you do mate these animals, you will still get whatever livestock that you want. And in doing this, Jacob deceives him, and he ends up having plentiful livestock. And what happens right after this? Jacob becomes pursued by Laban, similarly as he was by Esau. And now, obviously, this story does not end here, and we all know how this ends. But I just thought it's kind of important to note some of the parallelism that goes throughout the whole story of Jacob. He's a very complex individual, and of course, a very pivotal patriarch. But he is not a man who is, impervious to sin. And he's not a man who is drawn out to be a perfect individual, as none of us are. But it's a very interesting parallel that I see in my life, even especially this week. Not to compare myself to Jacob, but that important concept of your actions will always reap a very particular reaction. It's a very important thing we always have to be careful of. And it's been an especially challenging, to kind of personalize this. It's been a very challenging past week, past couple of weeks. And reading this Parsha, reading through some of this and reading through, obviously knowing how everything ends um, on a good note, but it hit especially a little bit closer to home for me. as realizing that even things that we might be doing, maybe we're not the best of heart, maybe we're not the best of intentions, or maybe if we're telling ourselves that we're doing these things with the best of heart or the best intentions, if it's not God's will, it never comes to pass. And something may be appearing that it's going a certain way. You might even forget about a certain thing you might have said. You might be forgetting about a certain thing you might have done. But if it was not done with God's intent, these things do not come to pass. And God's will always ends up coming to pass. God's will always ends up coming to the forward end of things. Esau, as we saw in the last parsha, it's not that he was just robbed of his birthright, is that he really was not, he was not really deserving of that birthright because he just sells it away for a little bit of food. And there's a lot of juxtapositions I guess we can take from that. But my main point tonight was just to first of all kind of highlight, bring out to center some of the parallelisms, showcasing in the way that Isaac was, let's say, tricked. Jacob goes through some of that same trickery from Laban, his uncle, and then he essentially does the exact same thing after the 14 years, after getting both Rachel, getting both Leah. He essentially kind of goes through the exact same cycle. It's a cyclical thing that just never kind of ends. And that is going to conclude my speaking. And again, I said I wish I could be there in person. I wish I could be there with you all. And I hope, even as mumbled as some of this might have been, hopefully you guys can hear me a little bit better. It has some finality and has made some form of sense in just showcasing some of that parallelism that's just talked about in the scriptures. Again, shalom, everybody.